Hello and welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schaede. I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of jfit. It is January 11th, 2022. And yes, Happy New Year. Akemashite omedetou gozaimasu. This is our Tigger that Taka from our jfit Japan Center made for us this year. And he's happy and hopefully he'll bring us strength and luck and a lot of joy this coming year. So you are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy just now. We are an international relations and public policy school with 7 different degree programs. One of our degrees is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our school, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And jfit is our Japan Center. It's we do research, we educate, we inform, and connect across the Pacific. More on jfit you can find at jfit.ucsd.edu. You can, if you go to that website, you can see our news and media button where you can sign up for our San Diego Japan newsflash. And right next to that is our Japan Zoominars button where you can look at older recordings of our show and also upcoming events. Our Zoominars are recorded. So during this event today, please feel free to type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. And if I read them out, I will refer to you only by your first name so that your privacy is protected. And by the way, if you go to this JZ gallery, this is what it looks like. So there are these various buttons, business and economy, politics, society, and everything else. And as you click those, you get these lineups. And today's event will be there beginning tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Today, of course, we're talking with Noah Sneider. But before I introduce him, let me just point out that in 2 weeks from now, we'll have Akira Igata here from Tama University, who has a recent paper on Japan's new economic statecraft. And that's really a nice word of saying geopolitics in 2022 and Japan's role in it. And on February 8th or 9th in Tokyo and Japan, we'll have Japan and cybersecurity in 2022 with Miho Matsubara from NTT. Please stay tuned. There will be more to come. And all right, with that, let me stop my share. And here's Noah Sneider from The Economist in Tokyo. Good morning, Noah, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to join the series, and akemashite omedetou gozaimasu to you too as well.
So let me introduce you, and then I'll introduce the recent pieces that you wrote, and then we'll have a conversation about those. So Noah Sneider is the Tokyo Bureau chief of The Economist, and don't have to explain why that's important. Before going to Tokyo, he was the Moscow correspondent where he covered Russia, the former Soviet Union, and also interesting places like the Ukraine and so forth. He is also, other than The Economist, he also writes in the New York Times, the New Republic, Harper's, The Atlantic, Slate, and many more. And by education, he has a degree in Russian and Eastern European studies from Pomona College, but he's not a newbie to Japan at all. In fact, he is a third generation in his family of many Japan experts, where people have lived and worked in Japan, and you know a lot about Japan. And so when you arrived in Tokyo, you hit the ground running in some ways. I'm not sure whether you speak Japanese, but a little bit, I guess it's coming. Right?
Enough
to get by. Okay, so what we're here to talk about is actually 2 recent issues of The Economist. There was the one on December 11th, and then also the one from January 1. And the December 11th one was special because it had a Japan special. It looked like this. I'm just opening it up. Japan on the front line. And Noah, you pointed out to me, this was the first Japan special that The Economist has run since 2010, so in a decade. And so my first question is the obvious question: why would The Economist run a Japan special now?
Yeah, so just a bit of sort of context. The the idea for these special reports generally in The Economist is to kind of step back from the weekly rhythm or the daily rhythm of the news cycle and try and take a kind of big picture look at a given country or a given topic, to reflect on kind of what the narrative is and what we think that the sort of big picture story is. And the idea is usually to do them at a juncture when either a country is in a kind of transition point or a historical sort of moment, or where a topic has sort of bubbled to a certain place. So for Japan, the beginning of the conversation about this report was the end of the Abe era and the beginning of Reiwa. So we felt like we had this sort of record-long prime ministerial tenure where a lot of things, we can get into sort of what happened during the Abe era, what changed, what didn't, but clearly was a significant phase in modern Japan's history. We had the sort of passing of the Tokyo Olympics, which had also been a kind of, at the very least, a symbolic milestone, and the beginning, again, of this new imperial era. So taken together, it seemed like a really sort of opportune moment to kind of take stock of Japan and to kind of ask, what do we think the story is for the next phase of Japan's history?
So the argument that you make in the special issue is that we overlook Japan at our own peril. Not necessarily because Japan has the answers, but Japan is trying things that we may learn from. And failure or success doesn't matter. It's just that Japan is a little bit, is the number one, in a funny way, to arrive at a nexus of complicated challenges. So therefore that makes it a harbinger of things to come. So what lay out a little bit of what the main argument of your story is.
Yeah, well, I mean, to just take it a step beyond your excellent summary, I think that for me coming here and observing both how readers respond to Japan, how editors respond to stories about Japan, and trying to sort of square that with my experience on the ground here, I felt that oftentimes people are sort of stuck in one of two outdated narratives, one of which is the narrative of decline and stagnation, this sort of hangover of the lost decades, the idea that Japan is kind of fading into irrelevance. And the other is that Japan is sort of maybe interesting, maybe functional, but so sort of different as to be irrelevant to the experience of people in the US or in Europe or other parts of the world, the sort of Japanese uniqueness. And both of those narratives kind of lead to people dismissing or ignoring Japan or looking to Japan only for a certain kind of story, cultural oddities, or again, sort of decline stories, rather than looking to Japan as a source of sort of insights into common challenges and common problems. And so the report kind of walks through a series of themes where I think Japan is grappling with problems that are face other countries, other parts of the world are facing. So we start with sort of geopolitics and the rise of China and the decline or uncertainty surrounding America's role, on the other hand. And these are pressures that obviously Japan has felt in some ways earlier and more intensely than the rest of the world, but which clearly are sort of defining the geopolitics of the 21st century. The second sort of big theme is disasters, and this is a place where again I think we're seeing a kind of Japanification of the rest of the world because of climate change. Japan has had to live with disaster risk throughout its history. The rest of the world is now having to learn to do that too. Trying to sort of pull out what Japan has learned from its experience and how that might be relevant to places that are now seeing fires and floods where there weren't before. Megacity management is another one. What makes Tokyo work as urbanization continues, as megacities grow, and especially sort of here in Asia. A lot of people in the region in particular are starting to sort of wonder how Tokyo came to be the way it is. We move then into demography, which is sort of well-trodden territory, but and we can come back to this, but I think in some ways the most important piece of this puzzle. And finally, we look at economics and Japan's experience with what we now call secular stagnation and a host of sort of conditions that from low interest rates to stagnant growth that have become common in other parts of the world. So across all of these areas, trying to pull out, as you say, not necessarily to say that Japan has all the answers or that Japan has solved these problems, but that Japan's experience is relevant and relevant in a policy sense. It's relevant as a sort of source of learning, both from failures and from successes for readers around the world.
Well, that's a great summary, and I shall footnote that it's beautifully written. And I have to tell you, I admire journalists. I mean, your content to page ratio is just so much higher than what we academics write, and your use of the English language is so much more advanced than what we do. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you.
Questions are coming in already. Actually, Hiroki wants to know, well, fine, I listened to what you just said. What issues or what can the United States learn from Japan? I mean, what are there some Japanese solutions that you see already, or what's the most important one? And you mentioned the disasters, and I think that maybe that's your number one.
Well, I think if we're talking about the U.S., that's maybe the sort of first place to turn, and I think there's a tendency to assume that that Japan's resilience or stoicism in the face of disaster. We all remember the images after 9/11 and the stories that followed. And there's a tendency to sort of attribute that to something kind of essentially Japanese that that really ignores a transformation that's happened. Even in quite recently, if you start with sort of the Kobe earthquake and look at systems that have been put in place, behaviors that have been adopted, and these are choices. I mean, they're not predetermined. These are policy choices that have been made to invest in infrastructure, to invest in planning, to think about resilience at all levels of governance, from building parks that have benches that double as stoves when you need to evacuate because of a disaster, to households. I mean, I was struck looking at survey data, the majority of Japanese households, this is before the pandemic, majority of Japanese households had discussed their individual disaster plans in the previous year or two. Think about your own community in the US, how many people had thought about what they would do in case of a disaster before the pandemic. So I think these are sort of sets of behaviors and sets of policies that can be adopted elsewhere. And I think we see the impact of that mindset during the pandemic here in Japan. I mean, there's a lot of people attribute the mask wearing and the cautiousness that we've seen, the Japanese public display during the pandemic to various forms of social pressure and tendencies towards cleanliness, and those may be factors. But I think it's important also to recognize that there's an understanding a shared understanding that when disaster strikes, it's everyone's business. It's not something you sort of outsource to a government far away. And I think that's a real contrast to what's happened in the US.
So you mentioned the choices, and that's something that I'm very interested in right now. And I want to kind of go a little bit to the economy, but I'll come back to this choice thing. So in your section on the economy, the subheader is not bad, but could be better. And when I first saw that, I had to laugh, and I said, "Oh, the Economist always has to be a little bit negative or something." I don't know whether that was, so I kind of laughed it off. And then I thought, no, I want to engage intellectually in this, because it's a very interesting subheader if you think about it. What you're suggesting here is that the trade-offs that Japan is making on economic policy or on overall societal policies is not what we would call Pareto optimal, right? So it's not, the trade-off outcomes are not bad, but they could be better, meaning Japan could actually do some things better without losing other aspects of it, right? So if you think about everything as a trade-off, I would say the Japanese society has decided that they value stability and lifetime employment and that sort of thing more than economic growth or profits, and that they value knowing where they can go in a disaster more than sort of some unorganized chaos that would allow startups to flourish more, right? And so what you're suggesting here is that the trade-offs could be optimized. Can you talk a little bit more about your view on what you learned on the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I would point to three and maybe even a fourth points that sort of came up in conversations regularly with policymakers, with central bankers, with analysts, and with business people here in Japan. One is the question of sort of what Japan spends its fiscal stimulus on. I think there's been a recognition that fiscal limits aren't what we thought they were, and that recognition has informed policymaking elsewhere, especially in the US during the pandemic. So another way in which Japan's sort of harbinger role is manifest. But here in Japan, there's a lot of worry that during this pandemic, in particular, the stimulus money has been directed in non-optimal ways, and that rather than investing in measures that could sort of boost long-term growth potential, for example, in childcare infrastructure, in things that might sort of boost the potential birth rate, in innovation, we're seeing a lot of cash being handed out to individuals who aren't spending it, and to companies that, in fact, there's a really fascinating paper by Hoshi Sensei that I cite in the report that looks at who's getting the loans and the stimulus, and it turns out, perhaps unsurprisingly, that a lot of the companies getting them are ones that were struggling even before the pandemic. So I think there's the question of sort of, okay, you can spend a lot more than you thought you could, but it doesn't give you a license to sort of spend unwisely. So that would be one piece. The second, and this is nothing new, but the female half of Japan's labor force, obviously there's been a lot of talk about womenomics, a lot of promises, a lot more women getting into the workforce, but clearly hitting ceilings of many kinds. And that seems to be an area where I don't think you need to necessarily lose stability or restructure the system to let to get more out of the talented women that are here already. Finally, I think the other piece of the puzzle that comes up a lot is the growing share of the workforce that falls outside that pact that you outlined. I mean, the sort of stability, preference for stability, so that the non-regular workers who, again, tend to be more female, tend to be younger, who are left sort of in a very precarious place, and for all of the talk that we've seen from Schaede about new capitalism and wage growth, there's been surprisingly little focus on this sort of dichotomy in the labor market, and I think that's something where there is a trade-off involved, certainly, but thinking about more protections for the sort of precarious part of the labor force would probably be to Japan's benefit.
So I have to laugh because it's such a point of view thing. So 60% of Japanese workers are in what they expect is a lifetime employment, like a long-term commitment. 60%. And so everybody's saying, oh, that is horrible. And I'd argue that in the United States, it's 0%. So how is 60% horrible, right? And isn't actually the non-regular workers, the other 40% that are non-regular, a good chunk of those are actually very high-paid consultants. And a growing number, right? So there are people that say I can actually make much more money if I'm a contract-based IT consultant, because and companies like to hire these people because they can maintain wage parity with a lifetime employee group and can hire these experts. And then of course there are the 30% of the employed workforce that are on 3-year contracts, but it's I always find it interesting how we get all worked up about this when in reality Japan has the highest percentage of people in stable employment in any of the large economies I know about, certainly at par with Germany and other European places. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the sort of like existence of the dichotomy that so if you have a system that and that's where I think you see a lot of the at least from what I hear from folks is the source of the growing worries about inequality, and of course when you step back and look at sort of data in perspective, you might wonder why growing inequality is at the top of the policy debate in Japan, but I think a big source of that is the sense that there are in fact two economies or two Japans that are increasingly sort of divergent. So your point is well taken, but yeah, it is a matter of sort of relative perception, whether you're sort of on the inside or outside of the system that's protecting people.
Yeah, and I think this tension also explains some of the policies that look a little bit funny if you look from afar. So why don't they just let lifetime employment go? There's so many young people that don't want it anymore, right? But there are also positive aspects to this entire system, and so many trickle-down effects that the system creates that nobody wants to just disabolish this, but maybe we're on our way. I don't know. So Rick, our mutual friend, has an interesting question. He observes that you have interviewed an amazing array of Japanese and non-Japanese opinion leaders for the special edition, and wonders whether you have found more pessimism among the Japanese interview partners or the non-Japanese interview partners, or was it mixed, or did you have a pattern in responses to your questions?
Yeah, it's thank you, Rick. It's a really interesting question, and something that really struck me while reporting this piece. I think folks in Japan have a tendency to be nowadays, which may be surprising, to be a bit more pessimistic and more self-critical than folks outside Japan looking at Japan. And I think part of it is sort of what's happened elsewhere in the world, and folks sitting in DC looking at the Japanese economy, the Japanese policymaking process compared to the state that America's in, find themselves having a slightly different perspective than folks in Tokyo comparing themselves to themselves a generation earlier. and I think there's also a bit more, and this is interesting on the economic front in particular. Economists and observers outside Japan in some ways are more sanguine about Japanese policymakers' ability to manage than folks inside Japan are, in particular looking at sort of the debt situation. So I think people closer to the ground here, and this maybe is going to be a tendency in any context, but people closer to the ground are more worried about all the ways it could go wrong. People a little further away are focused a bit more on how the shape of things looks right from a distance.
And so even optimists like myself or Jesper, or Carl, or people like that. I mean, of course, we understand there's a lot not quite right in Japan, but it always depends on the POV, right? And what is your benchmark? And one of the things that I observe is that, as you just said, put it very beautifully, Japan is benchmarking itself with the height of the bubble.
Yeah.
Which is a weird place to benchmark against, because that was actually unhealthy. There was a lot of speculation and gambling and casino type behavior, and not all was pretty. And to benchmark against 1989 or something is a really weird comparison mark, right? So I think maybe the young Japanese would feel much better if they could find another sort of thing to compare against. Or find a new aspiration, which the Olympics was supposed to be, as you mentioned, right? The Olympics was supposed to be this new awakening, and we can do it, and we're fine. And the 2020 Japan is different from the old Japan, but it's good in its own ways. And then that didn't happen.
Didn't quite pan out.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it is, as we were kind of talking about before we started the session, it's another way in which the lack of sort of international exchange due to the closed borders is a problem as well. I mean, that sense of sort of, and you see this especially with the pandemic, that sense of just perspective of sort of how things are going in Japan versus how they're going elsewhere is often missing. And I hope we'll be able to see each other in person in Tokyo this year, and all of you who visit from the US can explain what traumas those of us in Tokyo have not had to experience.
So David wonders why your section on Japanese politics seems to be the shortest, and it actually has a great picture of Kishida's new cabinet members, and they're all it's a whole bunch of elderly gentlemen, and well, there's actually 3 women on that picture, but so is there a reason why this was the shortest, or is there just so little to say about the LDP being a cartel that is not letting other new people in, or can you talk a little bit more about that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it probably has to do mostly with where the sort of report sat in terms of timing. And so this report came out after the latest LDP presidential and diet elections. And so we had written a lot about Japanese politics in the sort of weeks and months leading up to this report, and had done some quite sort of extensive pieces on internal LDP dynamics. And I think there is a limit for the general reader to how much people want to read about the LDP. So I think that was really what it's about. That said, it clearly is really important, and one of the sort of sub arguments of the piece or of the package is that Japan is sort of changing more than it seems on the surface, and that if you only sort of look at the upper layer, which tends to be dominated by the Showa generation of, as you say, old gentlemen in politics or in business, that Japan is different from the Japan that's emerging a generation or two below, and that in many ways we see sort of society and the leadership growing sort of in different directions, and I think one of the big questions for Japan going forward is whether politics, whether the LDP can channel some of these energies in productive ways, or whether the sort of old man at the top will continue to stifle those energies in ways that are probably less productive or less sort of hopeful for Japan's future.
So one of the things I always find interesting about Japan is that, if you look at other countries, when they want to change something, they start with the government, right? So if you want to have more equity and diversion in employment, at the local levels and in the federal government, we hire more diverse people in more equitable ways, right? And in Europe, the same would apply. If we want to raise minimum wage, we start with the public sector. If we wanted, so the public sector often is the place where it starts. And also, promoting women to the top, party politics can do that, right? But in Japan, change often starts in the corporate sector, where I just mentioned the quotas for the women, right? So when Prime Minister Abe introduced these goals, they were not called quotas, they were called goals, but I guess they were that sort of thing. The private sector was supposed to have 30% women in managerial positions, and the public sector 15%, because the public sector is too difficult for women, implicitly implying, right? Or something, or hours are too long, or whatever it is. And I think the same is true for the LDP. I mean, even Keidanren, which had been called the old boys club for a good decade, is now changing faster and is rearranging its structures compared to the LDP, which is pretty much a closed shop. And if you want to become a politician, you have to go through it's like the sumo or apprenticeship or even with other associations in Japan, where you have to do your tours of duty before you can even become important within the LDP. So that's actually very interesting. So how is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but it strikes me.
I think the glass half full view of Japanese politics is that Japan has avoided kind of the populism and the polarization and the instability that we see in other advanced democracies, and there's clearly some benefits to that. The flip side, I think, and I've one of the things I was struck by coming here, moving here from Moscow, was I kept hearing something I heard often from Russians when talking to Japanese about politics, which is, well, my vote doesn't matter, or I can't change anything, or why bother, going to vote? It's all the same anyways. Which was a bit of deja vu I didn't expect to encounter, and I think is worrying in its own way, and speaks to sort of the alienation that a lot of people, especially younger people, feel from the political process and their ability to sort of influence it. So I think that's a big risk going forward, and I think the response for a lot of people is to look in other spheres, to look in other directions, and to sort of channel their energies into other arenas, in particular into business. And so I think it's striking that you see a lot of bright Todai graduates who maybe once would have gone into Medi, who are now going into startups. You see people who once thought that bureaucracy was the way to make change, who are now working in, maybe a generation earlier might have thought the bureaucracy was the place to make change, who are now going into NGOs or volunteering or social entrepreneurship. Sorry, I'm just going to close my curtain here.
I was just going to say, you have some interesting, you got some interesting art going. So we have, you mentioned something about the Sakoku, and we haven't been traveling, and COVID has sort of made Japan a little bit more inside looking or navel gazing or whatever. We have a bunch of questions on this from Howard and Hiroki and others, whether this closing down and this COVID travel, and it, by the way, it ties into the LDP as well, I think. Is this current thing a setback? That we were at the cusp of getting some exchange, and let's compare and benchmark in different places and do politics in a different way, and suddenly here comes this virus, and it offers on a silver platter an opportunity for the conservatives in the country to say, ooh, we have to pull ourselves out of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are clearly clearly a lot of opportunities that have been missed, and a whole sort of cohort of people who are interested in Japan who haven't been able to get to Japan to study or to work. A lot of interpersonal exchange that hasn't happened, that was happening in bigger ways before the pandemic. A whole sort of tourism industry that had been really ramping up, that has suddenly been sort of cut off at the knees. And it's, I think, a short-sighted policy that isn't necessarily based in science, but is based in political realities, and the political reality is that seeming like you're protecting people from COVID is the politically expedient move. With that said, I think it's striking that the response, for example, from the business community in particular, has been striking. Not everyone agrees with this policy. I wouldn't sort of take the fact that this policy has remained in place as long as it has as a sign that all of Japanese society and all of Japanese government and all of the Japanese sort of leadership is on board with this. I hear a lot of grumbling about it from friends in the government who sort of say, well, we'd like to do something about this, but those guys at the Ministry of Health are, really, really careful, and we can't push our capital on this issue. We have lots of other things we need to to be dealing with. I think it's striking, look at Mikitani's comments yesterday, coming out sort of slamming the government for doing this. Keidanren even has been unhappy about this, and I think in terms of the longer term direction, I was struck doing the reporting for this piece, asking people, especially outside Tokyo, asking governors, mayors, local leaders about immigration. I was struck by the responses, both the generally positive tone and the, in some cases, sort of full-throated call for real reform in that area, and that's sort of the fourth piece to the economy puzzle I would have added before. But so not only the generally positive tone, but the positive tone in this particular moment. So this would be a really easy time for a mayor or governor or local business leader to dodge that question and say, well, we have a pandemic, now's not the time to be talking about it. We need to focus on keeping people safe, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of people I talked to not only sort of took up the issue, but seemed to be sending a message that no, we do want this to continue. And I hope it's something that the national government hears.
But your sense is that we will not be allowed back into Japan until the next election? Is that what?
That's my armchair political analysis. I mean, the upper house election is kind of looming this summer. For Kishida, clearing that hurdle is really important, and there is a perception, whether it's right or not, that these measures are basically popular, and that rolling them back would be seen as sacrificing the public's health for some economic benefits that only certain interest groups would feel. Folks in around Schaede, I think, see that those kinds of perceptions helps bring down Suga's government, and they want to avoid that at all costs. So I'm personally a little bit pessimistic about things opening up, for regular travelers anytime before the summer.
But this is another example of these trade-offs, right? Where we say, well, wait a minute, but Japan could be onto something. Right? I mean, if you look at the statistics and how Japan has fared in this whole mess, not too shabby. I mean, you picked the right country to be in during this horrible time, right?
Absolutely. It's been inside Japan, it's been I think the combination of relative safety and relative freedom of movement inside Japan throughout the pandemic has been unusual by international standards. That said, I'm not convinced that sort of the border closures are the key to that puzzle, and that clearly you have a lot of people, Japanese citizens, coming in and out of the country, going through quarantine, and the virus isn't checking people's passports. So I'm not sure that the sort of I'm not sure I would attribute the sort of COVID, relative COVID, lack of COVID to the border sort of closure alone, but yeah.
The counterfactual is not known either. So what can we say? Right. So we have a bunch of questions on Kishida. There's a set of questions on his new capitalism, and then the other is on your absolutely fabulous piece in the January 1 issue, which looks like this, right? And this is about the view from Tokyo, how Tokyo looks at China. So shall we start with the capitalism and then move to the China question? Yeah. So what is this new capitalism all about from your vantage point? Is it more old stuff, or is there something really to it?
It's a question I've been asking a lot of people here in Tokyo, and one that I've yet to get a clear answer to, even from just an anecdote, but chatted with one person who was on the New Capitalism Council just around the time it was formed, and I said, so what does New Capitalism mean? I mean, has he told you what you're supposed to be doing? And this person said to me, come back to me in a few months, we're supposed to figure it out. So I think this is a marketing slogan, a political sort of political tool more than it is a real policy. I think Kishida, for all of his revolutionary sounding talk, is the furthest thing from revolutionary that the LDP has. The sort of reality is that new capitalism, or a break from Abenomics, looks a lot more like sort of the unfinished business of Abenomics. And I think it probably is going to come down to sort of small bore policies rather than the big kind of big realignment that something like new capitalism makes you think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right? So I mean, I was actually thinking when I saw it, so it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Why didn't the Biden administration use new capitalism, right? It's much better than Build Back Better or something. Yeah. It's perfect marketing. It sounds good. This idea to increase wages when all other prices are staying the same and the government is pushing companies to show higher profitability strikes me as one of those trade-offs that's not possible. Something's got to give, right? So, but yeah, it's good. New is good. Capitalism is good, right? And so let's do it. I also thought that it was a label that's supposed to separate Japan from China. That we are a capitalist country, right? We Japanese do capitalism. So let's turn to China and how Japan views China. So Eve has the data for us He pointed out that since you wrote your piece, Japan's export dependence on China has actually increased to 24%, from 24 to 27%, if we include Hong Kong. And so Japan is really, now China is the #1 trading partner, #1 export and import player, right, with $100 billion each year, so it's sizable. And a lot of Japanese investments in China, corporate production sites and so forth. So how, tell us what you wrote in this piece, because I think it's actually this insight that Japan understands China better than anybody else. It's actually kind of interesting. Right?
Yeah. So it's a product of sort of long. The idea of the piece is to sort of say there's a lot of talk happening and a lot of attempts to sort of understand China from Washington, D.C. or Brussels or London, but to sort of ask, what do people here in the region, in particular, sort of here in Tokyo, see when they look at China? Given a much longer shared history, a much sort of obviously closer proximity, both geographically but also linguistically, culturally, and otherwise. I'm not sure that Japan necessarily sees things better or gets China better than anywhere else, but it sees China in its own way, and I think there are a few. Talking to Japanese China hounds and Japanese officials, Japanese policymakers who deal with China, there are a few things that really stuck out. One was this sort of sense that China today reminds people a lot of Japan itself in the run up to the Second World War. The sort of overconfidence, the real hubristic kind of belief in its superiority, and it's something that a number of people who know and have dealt with China throughout their careers have commented on, and so it's not posturing. It's they really believe that their system is better than the mess of the West. The other sort of piece is this question of sort of how decisions are made in China, and what Xi Jinping's leadership in China looks like compared to previous eras of Communist Party leadership, and there's a lot of worry here in Japan about this sort of shift to individual leadership around Xi, and when you start sort of mapping that out, it obviously matters quite a lot what that individual's background is, and people who've dealt with him and who've dealt with the Chinese leadership worry a lot that he's more divorced from, more isolated from sort of the global community, the rest of the world, than previous Chinese leaders have been. And finally, there's the economy. So as you point out, Japan's economy is deeply dependent on China, and I think that also informs the overall foreign policy. This attempt to balance between gaining from interactions with China's market and to kind of deter on the security side. It's a tricky balance Japan's been able to strike fairly well so far, but will become harder and harder in the future. But people here are also worried about sort of where the Chinese economy goes from now, and I was struck talking to folks working with big Japanese companies who a year or two ago were quite bullish, but who this year or towards the end of last year, I should say, were kind of worried about the mid to long term and wondered what Xi's recent sort of domestic crackdown on large tech firms is going to mean, sort of where the Chinese economy is heading, and Japan in some ways was prescient on the security side, and it'll remain to be seen whether these sort of worries about China's economy are similarly prescient.
From the U.S. perspective, I mean, one of the things that I found as I was looking at companies is that Southeast Asia is very much ignored in the US. I think people still think of it as it's a faraway place with a bunch of, maybe there are lots of people, but we don't know how many and so forth. Whereas Japan has long thought of Southeast Asia as a place where it's relatively easier to do business. It's culturally not as difficult as doing business in the West. I mean, for lots of business people telling me this, that, and they say, well, you accuse us of being a little bit awkward when we do business in the United States, but we don't actually, we're not global. We're actually doing pretty well in Vietnam and, in Thailand and Indonesia. It's easy for us there. It's hard for us in Europe. I get that, but it's not so hard in Asia, just like you guys have it hard when you come to Asia, right? So there's still this different, but Southeast Asia is becoming incredibly important for Japanese business. And I gather also in terms of economic statecraft or security issues.
Absolutely. I think in many ways, for folks, Japanese security and Japanese, Japanese strategists, economic and security wise, it is in many ways the key sort of playing field, and it's a place that Japanese prime ministers, if you look at sort of where Suga went on his first trip, it was to Southeast Asia. The recent agreement with Australia, the RAA, which is a big sort of signature early moment in Kishida's administration. Part of what has drawn Australia and Japan together is a shared awareness of the importance of ASEAN, and it's, as you say, it's a place where Japanese companies are extremely active. It's a place where, if you look at sort of infrastructure investments, for all of the hype that the Belt and Road gets, there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia where, in fact, Japan has a lot more FDI stock built up, a lot more invested in infrastructure. So Japan's deeply involved in the region and sees it as a crucial sort of crucial piece of the competition with China, and I think approaches it in a slightly different way than the US, which again is kind of born of this understanding that a lot of people in the region don't want to choose between America and China. They don't want to be driven into sort of Cold War style blocks. And when the US gets up and talks about systemic ideological competition, democracies, and authoritarianism, that it causes a lot of awkwardness in Southeast Asia in particular. So I think you're absolutely right. It's essential for Japan, and I did want to sort of I realize we're coming towards the end of this this hour, but I while I have the chance, I did want to ask you a couple of things to put my journalist hat on. I mean, you pointed out wisely when I first sent you the report that there's sort of a missing chapter which has to do with Japanese business and Japanese corporate strategy, and in many ways, if I had the space to write that chapter, it would have probably drawn heavily on your recent terrific book, and so I wanted to kind of ask you whether you see sort of this aggregate niche strategy that you lay out as a harbinger or a model for corporates elsewhere. I mean, do you see others in the region or companies in the US trying to learn from how Japanese companies have retooled themselves?
Well, that's a terrific question. So one thing we already know is that companies in Korea in particular, but also now in China, are looking at what the Japanese companies are doing and thinking, well, China is a little bit different because it's so big, but Korea is so small, and yet, it's just kind of caught in between this. We're making consumer end products, but clearly, at some point, electronics companies in other countries will be as good at this Samsung and LG are. And so the people there are already looking and say, we're going to go the way that Panasonic is going. Okay, so which way is Panasonic going? And the answer is out of consumer end products and go where the money is. And the money is higher upstream or higher differentiated, or, be a technology leader. So we've known for a long time that that's actually the transition, right? So if you look at the electronics industry, it used to be European and American firms. Then came Japan, and then came Korea. So there's this trend towards escaping the cost leadership position and moving into the differentiated position that the companies before have seen, right? And so in that sense, probably a lot of places in Asia are looking at Japanese companies and saying, okay, so what are they doing? How are they going to get out of here, right? And is that something that we could do? And my answer to that second question is maybe not, which is complicated. You can't just decide one day to be a technology leader, right? You have to actually build something and know something and grow something and be innovative around those things to be that technology leader. That's hard. And so it's not a strategy for everybody, but certainly the Korean companies are looking at this. And I also just learned that my book is going to be translated into Thai, which I thought was interesting. And so what's that about? I'll tell you as soon as I know. But definitely I think that there is a front runner role. And as you point out, I was struck by your sentence in the beginning of your special issue, that Japan is going to be on the front line, if not by knowledge and prescience, but by proximity, because it is in Asia, and a lot of stuff was going to happen in Asia first. And it used to be 30 years ago that people were looking at Germany and Russia maybe in a similar way as we're looking at Japan and China now. And that, how Germany was kind of sitting right there in the middle of the Cold War. By proximity, Germany was the hot place in the Cold War, and now by proximity, Japan is going to be the sort of the front runner in both in economics and business terms as it is in security terms, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It just reminds me, I was sitting, doing the reporting for this, I went and visited a number of SDF bases that they've sort of opened in the first island chain. And one of the generals in charge of one of the sort of new units down there said a version of essentially the same thing. I was sort of asking him about how his perception of Japan's role and the SDF's sort of role has changed throughout the course of his career, and he was recalling that when he entered the service, it was the Cold War, and the front line was Berlin, and as he said, it's not Berlin anymore, it's here. So I think that's at the very least that's how it feels to people. Feels to a lot of people in the region and in Japan.
So it's time for our final question, and those of you who are regulars know that I always ask Hugh Patrick's final question, which he has been using for years to pick people's brains. So allow me to pick your brain on this question. So what worries you most? What worries you most for Japan in 2022?
I think complacency, or a sort of reversion to the status quo. As we talked about before, and as you mentioned, there was really this sense that things were moving in a number of different areas. And I think there is, still a lot of change happening in Japanese society. The question is sort of whether the pace of change is commensurate with the scale of the challenges. And I worry that the current administration in particular is reverting back to a kind of status quo model, and I hear this from folks on a number of fronts. I mean, yesterday I was talking to people, one person deeply involved in sort of healthcare and health policy, and another involved in energy policy, and both described kind of a similar dynamic where, for all his faults, at least Suga recognized some of the structural issues and was pushing to address them, and what they've seen so far is a kind of replay of, okay, we don't have let's get everyone around the table, let's sit and have 50 panel meetings, let's talk about this without a sort of clear direction of where things are going, and again, it's a trade-off of sorts, but I think Japan can kind of ill afford to miss or to lose the momentum, and I worry that is happening on climate policy, on corporate governance reform, on a host of issues. So that's my worry for 2022.
It's like Jerry Curtis in response to my book is saying, yeah, slow is good, but when is slow too slow? Right?
Yes.
You can miss the train. It is possible. So thank you, Noah Sneider, for a fantastic hour of conversation, and also for your great work and bringing Japan back, having a special issue on Japan. I think there's a larger meaning to that Japan is important, and people have come back, especially also in the United States. We realize, there's another country in Asia that matters. Wait, it's not just China, right? So it's great that you're helping us understand that better, and please keep up the good work. And hopefully there will be this year an opportunity to meet in person. Audience, thank you very much for your great questions. Sorry that I didn't get to ask them all, but I will certainly pass them all on to Noah. And we'll see each other again in 2 weeks, hopefully, at 4 p.m. As you know, we changed the time. And we'll talk about Japan's economic statecraft. So we'll continue the conversation of Japan and China, and Japan in the Indo-Pacific, free, fair, open, whatever that is. So until then, please stay safe, take good care, and thanks again, Noah, for a terrific show.
Thank you for having me.